Off the southern coast of the island of Guadeloupe are a group of small islands most people have probably never heard of, even people from the Caribbean. However, those islands served as the backdrop for one of the most decisive and game-changing battles in colonial history. But before we get to those islands and that battle, we need to travel back centuries before that event to gain some historical context. In 1492, two major events took place on the Iberian Peninsula, the location of the nations we know today as Spain and Portugal. In that year, after centuries-long series of battles, local Christian states were finally able to drive out the Muslim Moors from the peninsula, bringing to an end some 700 years of Muslim domination of the area. The momentous event became known as the Reconquista or the Reconquest. With the Christians firmly back in charge, one of their first orders of business was to expel their Jewish population from the land, as they had always been persecuted and marginalized under Christian rule. And with the Muslims gone, sentiment and rule toward them returned to the norm. One place many of these Jews fled to was what would become the Netherlands, which at the time was under Spanish control. But around the same time these Jews were making their way to the Netherlands, there were rumblings of rebellion in the Netherlands against the Spanish and Portuguese. In the Netherlands, Jews were more or less welcome, and welcome to practice their faith in peace, something they were not allowed to do on the Iberian Peninsula. They were mostly welcome in the city of Amsterdam, as other Dutch cities were not too sold on them. The Jews, having been experts in commerce and business for centuries, helped to quickly transform Amsterdam into a major economic center, sparking Dutch emergence to challenge the other European colonial powers. In 1566, the Dutch went into full revolt against the Spanish crown, starting what would become known as the 80 Years' War. By 1572, they broke away and formed the independent Dutch Republic. Fueled by Jewish financiers in Amsterdam, the Dutch began to take to the seas in search of lands to conquer and colonize. One place they muscled in on was Portuguese Brazil, specifically the coastal city of Recife, which they wrested from Portuguese control in 1630 and renamed New Holland. During their near 25-year control of that city, pioneering Jews dominated the commerce scene, engaging in sugar production and importation of enslaved Africans. On a side note, an Englishman by the name of James Drax from the British colony of Barbados visited New Holland and took interest in the sugar production industry there and took the expertise back to Barbados and began what would become the plantation system in the Caribbean, built around sugarcane production and supported by the labor of enslaved Africans. In 1654, the Portuguese rose up and took back Recife and expelled the Dutch from the area. Some fled to Dutch-controlled Guyana, today's Guyana and Suriname, while others fled to New Amsterdam, today's New York City, Curaçao, and Saint Eustatius, which were all Dutch possessions at the time. Jews set up a network between all these Dutch possessions, and Saint Eustatius, as small and relatively unknown as it is today, became a critical location that provided assistance to the American rebels during the American Revolution against England. By this time also, not only was England at war with her rebel colonies in the Americas, she was also at war with the Dutch. And while not officially at war with France, that empire was actively working in the open to support the American rebels in an attempt to weaken British power. When the British got wind of the idea that the Dutch were using Saint Eustatius as a funnel site to smuggle munitions and other goods from Europe to the American rebels, they sent General George Rodney to the island to extinguish the contraband trade. So on January 3, 1781, Rodney arrived on the island from the south, while the American Revolution raged on the American mainland. He also dispatched part of his fleet to surveil the coast of Martinique to keep an eye on French fleets stationed on the island. Rodney took up the venture because he was heavily in debt and saw the opportunity to claim some glory and hopefully some wealth. Rodney proceeded to not just capture the island, but he also plundered and looted it. He banished the Jewish population to nearby St. Kitts. Some escaped to the Danish colony of St. Thomas, where they eventually founded one of the oldest synagogues in the Western Hemisphere. Rodney also confiscated their property, and it is said that he even took possessions from their persons and even the dead in their cemetery. The plunder was so great, Rodney called for his dispatch ships to come back to Saint Eustatius to help load the wealth, a move that would prove regrettable. A mission that was supposed to take a few days or weeks turned into months. While Rodney was occupied with Saint Eustatius, the French fleet out of Martinique, led by Comte de Grasse, quietly slipped past initial British surveillance, headed for Saint Domingue, today's Haiti, which would then move on to Chesapeake Bay or Virginia. This was a critical oversight by Rodney, who had been busy sending treasure-laden ships back to England, as well as going back to England himself due to health issues and to refit his ships. He did leave some ships behind, however, headed by Rear Admiral Thomas Hood, to track the French fleet, but the French fleet ran a course outside the normal shipping lanes to avoid detection. Hood took a more direct route to Chesapeake Bay, arriving on August 25, 1781, but he arrived to find no French ships in the area and moved on to New York instead. The French fleet arrived a few days later on August 30th, providing support and reinforcement to General George Washington, leader of the American Continental Army. Admiral Hood, now finding out that the French fleet had arrived, returned back to the bay with backup, but compared to the French, the British ships were not in the best of shape and eventually were repelled by Comte de Grasse's French fleet. The naval victory over the British Navy forced the surrender of British Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis to George Washington at the coastal town of Yorktown, effectively ending the American Revolution. Comte de Grasse eventually took his fleet back to the Caribbean, to the island of Martinique via Saint Domingue. Plans were in the works with the Spanish to strike a death blow to the British in the Caribbean, notably taking the prized possession of Jamaica from the British. In the meantime, Comte de Grasse invaded and grabbed the island of St. Kitts from the British in the Battle of Brimstone Hill in February of 1782 before moving on to Martinique to the south. The following month, George Rodney, under much criticism and shame back in England for his critical miscalculation, which in part led to the British losing her American colonies, arrived back in the Caribbean theater, landing on the British colony of St. Lucia to the south of Martinique. He was aware of the French-Spanish attack plans on Jamaica. The French seemed to be aware of Rodney's presence to the south also, but seemed to figure they had a head start on him. But before the French departed Martinique on April 7, 1782, Rodney had already outfitted the ships with new technology, using copper sheathing on their hulls to increase speed. He then went on the pursuit of the French fleet, encountering them off the southern coast of the French colony of Guadeloupe, near some small islands known as Îles les Saints, or the Islands of the Saints, which also sits to the immediate northwest of the island of Dominica. The date was April 9, 1782. The naval battle that would ensue would become known to history as the Battle of the Saints, or the less used Battle of Dominica. This was Rodney's opportunity to rescue his reputation and exact some measure of revenge for his blunder the previous year. The battle ensued, and due to some fortunate turns, such as wind direction, the British fleet managed to break the French line and use a tactic called breaking the line, where the British ships managed to pass broadside in front of the French ships, taking away the French ability to fire from their broadsides. As the battle raged on for the next 4 days, the French fleet took a tremendous pounding, scattering the remaining ships and leading to the French surrender on April 13th. Incidentally, one of the British ships was captained by the younger brother of Charles Cornwallis, who had surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown, Virginia, just 6 months earlier. The French ships that escaped the carnage fled to Saint Domingue, and all plans that were scheduled with the Spanish to conquer Jamaica were scratched, and thus England held on to her Caribbean colonies, preventing further loss of colonies in the Americas and establishing it as a dominant naval and colonial power in the region. Though Rodney was heavily criticized by some back in England for not pursuing the surviving French ships, he still received the hero's welcome and compensated handsomely for his victory, receiving payments that were to be passed down to his family for perpetuity. The British victory in that war also sent ripples through Europe and the United States, forcing the new country of the United States to recognize they had lost the power of the French behind them as an ally. England ended up holding the upper hand in all negotiations, stunting all French and Spanish aggression against them, at least for the time being, while also beating back fleeting post-war demands by the United States. In addition, with France losing the war in humiliating fashion, it caused a domino effect back in France itself because just 70 years later, the French Revolution began, bringing to an end the French monarchy and the subsequent start of the Haitian Revolution on the heels of that history-changing event. France would then go on to lose all its territory on the American mainland via the Louisiana Purchase and other negotiations. In short, in the course of 1 year, England went from the humiliation of losing her American colonies, partly because of George Rodney's obsession with looting Saint Eustatius, to regaining her footing and dominance with Rodney's resounding thrashing of the French fleet off some relatively unknown tiny Caribbean islands far away from the shores of Europe. In fact, Rodney's battle tactic in the Battle of the Saints were used in future naval battles by the British, fetching victories in each, including the famous Battle of Trafalgar that immortalized the war hero Horatio Nelson, who had previously married his wife on the Caribbean island of Nevis. Today, there stands a sculpture of George Rodney in Spanish Town, Jamaica, in commemoration of his victory that not only saved Jamaica for the British, but as it appeared, the future of the British Empire.